There's a rolling joke in the web development family that the peak of human knowledge and the real flex of designing capabilities is, to center a div on a website. It's funny because in the ancient times you needed to use some shady shenanigans, and now you can just simply use a great CSS trait called FLEXBOX, which we'll cover in this particular video. Okay, so I have devised this very basic scene. As you can see, I've got index.html file with 3 divs labeled item 1, and the classes are labeled as well. So we've got item 1, 2, and 3 inside a div with a class container. Just a title and a link to a style sheet. Style sheet CSS defines some very basic look to the container and the particular child items, which you can see on the right side, and we are using the server live HTML live to show it several stuff defined so that it will look as something not that generic. Alright, so as you can see in our HTML and in our CSS we don't have a flexbox yet, so we need to assign it. So let's scroll to the very bottom and create a new container class, CSS class selector, and here we'll just use a display property to assign flexbox to our parent element. So we'll write display and flex, and just like that we already have assigned flexbox. And as you can see that the display of those child items, it has changed because flex or flexbox, the property applies 2 axes to the parent element, and the main axis in this particular example will be the horizontal one, which is called basically the main axis. And then we have another axis which is perpendicular, always perpendicular to the main axis, and it's called, probably guessed, cross axis. In this case it's a vertical one. So why it's important? Basically, if we want to justify or align the items in some way, we need to know what properties and values to use in order to achieve the effect we want. So by default our items will be assigned in a row, and that's being governed by the property called flex direction. And as you can see, we've got 4 values we can assign, 4 main values. Column and row are the most important, and then we've got just a reverse versions of those 2 values. So by default we have a row. As you can see, nothing changed, but if we set it to column, then it will appear to be stacked on top of each other, with item 1 first according to HTML being on the top. And so in the column version, when we set the direction to column, we'll see that the main axis turns to be a vertical one. So that's how we can swap the main and cross axis, just by specifying the direction of the flexbox to either column or row. If we set column reverse, the order of the items will be reversed visually, and also the beginning of the axe will be swapped, and that's how the order is achieved. So now that we know which axis is the main one, let's decide and see how we can actually specify the location of our items in regards to the parent element. So we've got our 3 items and they are now aligned to the very top. Just please do not mind the margin which I put just to see the difference between the borders of the items of the parent item and the items. As you can see, if we remove the margin from the items, it will be stuck on top of each other. There is just a small tiny difference, but that's really nothing there. So basically just assume that they are aligned to the very top edge of the container. However, if we now want to set them to the without changing anything to the axis, so we'll leave this property alone for the moment. So we want them to move to the very edge, to the outer edge or in this case to the bottom edge of the container, we have to use the justify content property, and we'll set at the very beginning, so by default we've got it set the value to flex start, as you can see. So we have the axis that starts at the top, and it's justified, the content is justified to the top, right? So if we set it to flex end, it will be moved to the very bottom. And if we now change the direction to row, the same applies. However, at the moment it's maybe not that clearly visible, but yeah, we'll see in a second. We can change it to something different, for example center, and then we'll have it centered vertically, which is very pleasant to see, because in those 3 lines of code, CSS code, we can put something into the very center as far as the vertical axis is concerned, which is a very useful thing to remember and to know. There are many more properties, values that we can use. For example, space and something. Space between will move the items along the whole axis, so they'll basically stretch to the whole size of the axis, and then make their size as compact as possible, basically however compact they need to be depending on the items. For the moment the height is not being specified, so it's auto, so basically it shrinks so that you know, all the padding items is not, everything is visible but nothing more, right? So after that the flexbox will take the whole white space, the whole space that's left, and then divide it evenly and put it between every pair of items, as in this example. So then again, do not look at this margin, we'll remove it for the moment. Not this one. So we'll remove the margin. As you can see, there is the space, this one and this space, those are both equal. On the other hand, we've got space evenly, which will also take the space between the edges of the container. So the space between edge of the container and between items themselves, they are even. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces this time. And then we have space around, which will take the space again and divide it in such a way that between the item and the edge of the container you will have, let's say, 1 unit, and between items you'll have 2 units. So the spacing between items will be twice the amount as the between item and the edge of the container. Again, it's better visible without the margin. So as you can see, this one is equal to something, this one it will be equal to the double of the same value. So that's justify content. Similarly to justify content, we've got align items property, which is used this time to align items in regards to the cross axis, so horizontal in this particular scenario. And we've got 5 values. So flex start, as you can see, it aligns itself to the left. Flex end will align itself to the right. Then we've got center and baseline. So the baseline aligns the items in regard to the text. So as you can see now, everything is more or less equal, so that's why they are aligned to that value. But now if we let's say move one item, so we'll create a new selector just for item 1, and we'll set the margin left to value of, like, let's say 50 pixels. Not only the item 1 will be moved more to right, all the other items will be moved as well, which can be pretty useful if we want to do something based on the text design. And then stretch. We'll stretch the items to fill the whole container, which you don't see because we have specified the width, but if we remove the width, then they will stretch to fill the container. And the default value of align items is actually stretch. So if we set it to flex start, they will shrink, and yeah, basically just like that. So let's return that. Then there is very beautiful property for the Flexbox, which we'll not see. Let's change that one to justify content to flex start the beginning, and flex direction to row, so that we can see it better. And now the stretch works, but let's say flex start, so to the very top. And if we now shrink our window, you will see that the items shrink so that they can fit the content. However, after some point, they will just go outside of the Flexbox, of the parent container. What if we do not want that to happen? At the very default state, Flexbox denies the possibility of wrapping items. So to see that better, we will we'll copy items to have more of them, and then we'll use the property called flex wrap, which is by default set to no wrap. So as you can see, nothing will happen. But if you change it to wrap, then suddenly the items will be, well, wrapped basically, right? So just to see the order, let me quickly change the numbering so that we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 items. And also the wrap reverse value will be basically the same. However, the order will be reversed, as the name implies, right? So now that we have wrapped something, we'll see some slightly strange behavior in regards to the spacing between the items. And to modify that, we can use yet another property called align content. So not align items, but align content. And it's basically the same as justify content. However, this time we will be aligning those lines the flex items are, laid on. So if we set it to flex end, we'll go to the very bottom, flex start to the very top. So basically there will be no additional spacing between them. And yet again, let's remove the margin, and by default, there is no spacing between the items. However, we could define the spacing using gap property. So now we can set, let's say, 10 pixels. So that's one value that will specify the gap between the items and the lines in both horizontal, so horizontally between items, and vertically between the lines. However, if we change the direction, then between lines will be swapped. So the horizontal vertical definition is applicable to either row or column. So if we set to column, then basically there's no wrapping because we've got too few items. But if we copy more, then again we've got the gap, and we can specify the gap between rows and columns by using two values, or by shorthand using one. Then it will be applied to the same thing. So now as a row, and you can as you can see that the gap is being applied, right? So that will be the gap. And again, with the align content, we can specify more properties. So so we can set it to center, to the very center, space between, and space around. All right, or space. Yeah, let's set it to flex start. One more thing for which we do not need that many items, so we'll promptly delete them. Let's go back to our 3 items and let's delete those wrapping properties. For the moment, we don't want the items to have any particular spacing between them, because we will look at the how to fill the empty space if we want them, all the items combined, to stretch to the very width or height of the container depending on the direction. So let's say to column, because it will be better visible. So let's assume that those 3 items in total combine to about approximately 50% of the height of the container. So now we'll see how property called FlexGrow works on those items. So FlexGrow property is used to specify how much a flex item should grow, as the name implies, relative to the other flex items. But default the value is 0, and this time the property will be applied to the child item on its own specifically, not on the parent item. So we'll need to use for example, item 1, and we'll use item 1 for this example. So we need a selector for the child component, and here we'll say the flex grow property by default is 0, so we set it to 0, nothing changes. But if we set it to 1, suddenly the item devours the whole white space. That's, well, it'll have to be white, but the whole empty space that's on the particular axis, and we are talking about the main axis to be precise, because remember, we are working on column, and on column direction the main axis is vertical, so it consumes all the empty space and then grows the component. However, what if we set the same property on item 2? Well, it turns out that the items, item 1 and item 2, will basically share the empty space between them. So if we set it to 0, then nothing will change in regards to that item. So if we set it to 0 on number 1, then number 2 will eat and use the whole empty space that's available. And also the empty space will be used to that much extent so that items will not get shrink too much, so that their content will be pushed out of the boundaries of the item, etc. So we'll just use the whole empty space that's outside the items. It will not shrink them. But if we have items, multiple items that use the FlexGrow property, then basically the empty space will be divided evenly. However, the proportions of the space that's divided between the items depends on on the values of the FlexGrow property. So if we set it both to 1, then it will combine the space that's empty, then see what's the total of the values that we put here. So the total is 2, and 1 out of 2 is half. So basically they will get half each. But if we set this one to 2, then the divided space will be in total, let's say it will be 3 units. So the item 1 will receive 2 units, and the item 2 will receive 1 unit. So basically it will receive 1/3, and this one will receive 2/3 of the empty space. It's basically working on the proportion and ratio of the space used. If we set it to 9 and this one to 1, then item 1 will receive 90% of the space and number 2 will receive 10% of the space. Sometimes it's better to use bigger numbers. So setting it to 1 and 9 and also 10 and 90, there is no difference between those two values because it's all about proportions. And then we have a sibling property called shrink, flex shrink, and basically that property is used to specify how much the item should shrink in relative to the other flex items. So by default the value is 1. So well, we technically don't have to write anything. However, to see the effect, let's go to row and let's remove the width parameter. So now when we try to shrink the browser window, we can see that to some extent we can shrink the items, but after some point when the content basically gets shrink to the point that there is no possibility to shrink them further, it starts to overflow. But before that there is some margin for shrinking. But if we set this flex shrink property to 0, then item 1 will basically say that, hey, I don't want to get shrunk. So well, let's look how it starts to behave. So the first attempt to shrink is to push the push number 2 to separate line so that some space is safe for the shrink process. But now item number 1 says that, well, I don't want to do that, and basically it does not get shrunk. And if we specify some value here, for example 3, then it means this item number 1 will shrink 3 times as fast, meaning that the value of the shrunk value will be triple as much on the item 1. So the area that the item will shrink, basically, as you can see, for some to some extent it shrinks more. However, it's not that clearly visible. If we now set it to some value other than 1, bigger, let's say like 3, then it will mean that the item 1 will shrink 3 times as fast as items that have value set by default to 1. So basically, for every 1 unit of the shrunk area that's being taken away, the item 1 will have 3 times as much. So as you can see, for the moment, those items shrunk already slightly because we are making the window narrow, and the item 1 has been pushed, has been shrunk just tiny bit more. And also item 1 will be the first one to reach the threshold, and after that number 2 and number 3 will get shrunk at the same time. And also there is a flex basis, a property. Let's get rid of that. So we've got flex basis property, which says that whatever value we put here, that's the value that the item should be, that the size of the item should be equal to before all the remaining space is being distributed. So if we set it to 50%, then item 1 will be put to 50% of the container all the time, and then all the rest of the area of the empty space will be distributed accordingly. If we set it to 10%, it will be basically too small to fit the content, so it will then grow to fit the content. So that's also worth remembering. But if we set it to, let's say, 40, and we'll see that it takes 40% of the width, and then item 2 and item 3 are normal, and we still got some space left. But right now, if we set anything regarding space, like grow, let's put item 2 and flex grow to 1. Item 2 will eat the remaining space, so it will not take into account the space that item 1 has already taken because of the flex basis property. So let's remove that, and let's have a look at flex property, which is basically a shorthand for the 3 things we've been talking about. So the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Basically, by default, if we specify only one value, value number 2 and number 3 are set to be default. In flex grow, if we set it to 0, then that's the default, and then 1, and then 1. So those are the default values. However, we could also then specify this 40%. As we mentioned, so that's just a shorthand. One last property we'll talk about is order property, which is also specified within the child element. So in this case, order is by default it's set to 0, so nothing changes if we set to 0. And well, unsurprisingly, whatever value you put, that value will be used in order to specify the order of the elements in the particular parent element, in the parent flexbox, to be precise. So by default everything is 0, and then the HTML order of elements is taken into account. What if we want to move something to the very beginning? Then we need to set it to value, and here be aware that the smaller value, the more it's pushed to the beginning. So if we set it to -1, then it will be set to at the very beginning, which makes no difference because that's item 1 is already at the beginning. So let's look at item 3 selector, and we specify not orphans, order property to -2. And now you can see it's pushed to the very beginning because our justify and align items properties are set to start. Basically that's that. If we set item number 1 to, let's say, 1, so let's remember that item 2 order will be 0. So basically the order will be -2, 0, 1 in ascending order. So now this one will be first, this one will be second, and this one will be third. And basically the order property is I do not encourage you to use that. Use it if you must, but using it basically just messes with the HTML order of elements. And one more thing is we've got also align self property, which is the same as align items. However, it overrides this align items property in the parent element, and we can specify some other value in the in the child element. So if we've got flex start, for example, let's set it out of spite to flex end, and then we can see that item 1, instead of being in the group together at the very top, goes to the very bottom along the cross axis of the flexbox. So basically you align the element along the cross axis without taking into regard whatever the flexbox says for the whole group. So basically that's just that. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something from it. If you did, then you can consider liking or subscribing the video, or whatever. Just stay safe and be sure to use the FLEXBOX in your new front-end development project, because it's cool.